It's a warm Friday evening in 1963. A young man, maybe 22, 23 years old, just got his paycheck, walked into a Chevrolet dealership in Ohio, and drove out in the most unusual American car ever built. He felt like a genius. He felt like he'd discovered a secret the rest of the country hadn't figured out yet. 3 years later, that same car would be the most hated automobile in America. And nobody, not him, not the engineers who built it, not even General Motors itself, saw it coming. To really understand this story, you have to go back. Way back. Back to a time when American cars weren't just transportation. They were a statement of identity, a declaration of who you were and how much you'd made of yourself. It's the late 1950s in the United States of America. The country is booming. World War II is over. The economy is roaring, and the suburbs are spreading outward from every city like rings on a pond. Young families are buying houses, buying refrigerators, buying televisions. And they are absolutely, without question, buying cars. But the cars Detroit is building in this era? Brother, they're something else entirely. We're talking about automobiles the size of ocean liners. Machines dripping with chrome trims so thick and heavy it would give a silversmith a heart attack. Tail fins jutting skyward like the wings of some prehistoric metal bird, designed by stylists who apparently believed that bigger meant better, flashier meant finer, and horsepower was the only language worth speaking. These cars had V8 engines that could shake the ground when they idled. They had wheelbases longer than some Manhattan apartments. They drank gasoline the way a sailor drinks rum, enthusiastically and without much concern for tomorrow. A good day at the pump was 12 miles per gallon. A great day was maybe 14. And Americans loved them. Or at least they told themselves they did. Because in post-war America, a big car wasn't just a vehicle, it was proof. Proof that you'd made it. Proof that you were doing all right. Proof that whatever your father had gone through, whatever he'd sacrificed during the Depression or the war, it had all been worth it. But here's the thing about excess. It always creates a reaction. And by the late 1950s, the reaction was already building. Not everyone wanted a land yacht. Not everyone needed one. Suburban families were beginning to realize that two cars in the driveway made more sense than one giant one. Women who had entered the workforce during the war had never really left it, and they needed their own vehicles for their own lives. Young people, the very first ripples of what would become the baby boom generation, were coming of age and looking for something that felt like theirs, not their parents'. And filling that void, filling it quietly and efficiently and with remarkable effectiveness, was a little car from West Germany, the Volkswagen Beetle. Now, the Beetle was almost comically simple. It had an air-cooled four-cylinder engine mounted in the rear. It had no conventional trunk in the back, just a small storage area up front. It was slow. It was basic. By American standards, it was almost embarrassingly modest. But it was also cheap to buy, cheap to run, easy to park, and here's the part Detroit didn't want to admit, genuinely clever in its engineering. By 1959, Volkswagen was selling close to 200,000 Beetles a year in the United States. 200,000 cars. That was real money flowing across the Atlantic, real market share walking out of American showrooms and into import dealerships. And General Motors, the largest, most powerful, most influential automobile manufacturer the world had ever seen, was watching every single one of those sales with growing alarm. Inside the halls of General Motors in Detroit, there was a man with a plan. His name was Ed Cole, and if you love American performance cars, you probably already know that name. Ed Cole was the kind of engineer who made other engineers nervous because he was always thinking bigger, always willing to break a rule if the result was worth it. He had already made his mark on the industry a few years earlier when he was the driving force behind the small-block V8 engine that powered the legendary 1955 Chevrolet. That engine, compact, efficient, powerful, had changed the game completely. The small-block V8 would go on to become arguably the most successful engine design in automotive history. But now, Ed Cole had a different kind of challenge in front of him. GM's top brass had decided that the company needed to respond to the import invasion. Not with a slightly smaller version of their existing cars. That wasn't going to cut it. No, they needed something genuinely different. Something that could meet the Europeans on their own terms. Something bold. And Ed Cole, given the assignment, did what Ed Cole always did. He got bold. The concept he developed was unlike anything General Motors had ever attempted in volume production. A rear-mounted engine, like the Beetle, but bigger and smoother. Air-cooled, so there'd be no radiator, no water pump, no coolant to worry about. A flat six-cylinder layout, meaning the cylinders were horizontally opposed, lying flat rather than standing upright, which would lower the center of gravity and reduce vibration. And the whole body would be a unibody design, meaning the body and frame were built as a single unit rather than a separate body sitting on a separate frame. That was still relatively rare in American manufacturing. The result, Cole believed, would be a car that was lighter, more fuel-efficient, more nimble, and more interesting to drive than anything Detroit had produced before. It would be a genuine American alternative to the imports, not a pretender, not a shrunken version of a full-size car, but a real, original, thoughtfully engineered machine. They called it the Corvair. And in the autumn of 1959, the first one rolled off the assembly line as a 1960 model. America had its answer to the Beetle. Or so everyone hoped. The first time most Americans laid eyes on the Chevrolet Corvair, a lot of them did a double take. Because this thing did not look like anything else in an American showroom. No chrome overload. No jutting fins reaching for the stratosphere. No hood stretched out endlessly over a massive engine bay. Instead, the Corvair had clean, almost understated lines, smooth and European in character, with a simplicity that felt almost radical by the standards of the day. Open the trunk, except it wasn't where you expected it. The trunk was in the front, because the engine was in the back. Pop that rear lid, and there it was. The flat six, sitting low and compact, its cylinders fanning out horizontally like a mechanical butterfly. It was strange. It was different. And for a certain kind of buyer, a buyer who prided themselves on being a little smarter, a little more sophisticated than the average Joe, it was irresistible. The engine displaced 140 cubic inches, about 2.3 liters, and produced 80 horsepower in its base form. By American V8 standards, that was modest. By import standards, it was competitive. The car was light, the gearing was responsive, and on winding roads, the Corvair had a balance and agility that American cars simply didn't offer. The automotive press was intrigued. Road and Track, which was the Bible of serious car enthusiasts in that era, praised the Corvair's concept and its driving character. Car and driver took notice. Even publications that typically focused on traditional American performance acknowledged that Chevrolet had done something genuinely interesting. Sales were solid right out of the gate. Chevrolet moved over 200,000 Corvairs in the 1960 model year. The lineup expanded rapidly. There was a station wagon version called the Lakewood, a van called the Greenbrier, and even a pickup truck variant called the Rampside that had a hinged door in the side of the bed, making it easier to load cargo. They thought of everything. By 1962, Chevrolet introduced a turbocharged version of the Corvair that produced 150 horsepower. In a car that weighed less than 2,500 pounds, that was genuinely quick. Enthusiasts took notice. Here was an American compact that could hold its own against European sport coupes at a price that working people could actually afford. Ed Cole's gamble, it seemed, was paying off. The Corvair was proving that American engineers could play the game by a different set of rules and still win. But underneath all that optimism, there was a problem. A real, genuine engineering problem that the people who knew about it, and some of them absolutely knew about it, had decided not to fix. Here is a basic truth about physics that no amount of clever styling or enthusiastic marketing can change. When you put a heavy engine behind the rear axle of a car, you fundamentally alter how that car behaves at the limit of its handling. In a traditional front-engine, rear-drive American car of the early 1960s, the weight distribution was such that when a driver lifted off the throttle in a corner, when they took their foot off the gas, the weight would shift forward, pressing the front tires harder into the pavement, increasing front grip, helping the car stay stable. In a rear-engine car, the opposite happens. When you lift off the gas in a corner, the weight shifts toward the front of the car, away from the rear wheels, the very wheels that are trying to provide traction and keep the back end from swinging wide. This phenomenon, where the rear end breaks loose and slides outward, potentially spinning the car, is called oversteer. And in its most dramatic form, when it happens suddenly and without warning, it's called snap oversteer. It is, to put it plainly, the kind of thing that can turn a scenic Sunday drive into a very serious accident. Now, to be absolutely fair, because this story deserves fairness, snap oversteer was not unique to the Corvair. The Volkswagen Beetle had it. Other rear-engine European cars had it. It was a known characteristic of this layout, and experienced drivers who understood it could manage it. The Porsche 911, which would debut in 1963 with a similar layout, would spend decades developing a reputation as a car that rewarded skilled drivers and occasionally punished overconfident ones. But the Corvair had some additional factors working against it. The first was its swing-axle rear suspension. In this design, each rear axle is a single rigid piece that pivots at the center differential. When the suspension compresses, when the car hits a bump or leans in a corner, the wheel tilts inward at the top, reducing the amount of rubber contacting the road. This is called camber change, and in certain cornering situations, it could cause a dramatic reduction in rear grip. The second problem was a compromise that had been made in the name of cost savings. Ed Cole's engineering team had identified the issue. They had developed a solution, a front anti-roll bar, a relatively simple component that would connect the front suspension on both sides of the car, limiting body roll and helping balance the front-to-rear weight transfer in corners. This would have significantly improved the handling characteristics of the early Corvair. The cost of adding this component? $15 per car. The accountants at General Motors said no. $15 might not sound like much, but multiplied across hundreds of thousands of cars, it added up. And in their analysis, the handling characteristics of the car, as built, were within acceptable limits. The customers, they reasoned, wouldn't notice. It is one of the most consequential $15 decisions in the history of the American automobile. Because some customers did notice. And they weren't just noticing in the way that enthusiasts notice when a car is a little sharper or a little softer than they'd prefer. Some of them were noticing in parking lots and emergency rooms and, in the worst cases, in courtrooms. Accident reports began to accumulate. Stories of Corvairs spinning out on curves that should have been routine. Stories of experienced drivers who suddenly found themselves sideways on a rural highway without quite understanding how it had happened. There were rollover incidents. There were fatalities. Was the Corvair uniquely dangerous? That question, it turns out, would take decades to properly answer. And the answer, when it finally came, would be more complicated than almost anyone expected. But in the early 1960s, the question was just beginning to be asked. And a young man in Washington, D.C. was already gathering evidence. Ralph Nader was not the kind of person you'd expect to shake one of the most powerful corporations on Earth. He was young, in his early 30s, when the Corvair story reached its peak. He was thin, serious, and lived with an almost monastic simplicity that put him in sharp contrast with the corporate world he was challenging. He didn't own a car. He shared an apartment. He ate simply, worked obsessively, and cared about consumer protection with a passion that his friends described as almost religious in its intensity. Nader had been tracking automobile safety issues for years. He had worked on the problem as a law student at Harvard, written about it for academic publications, and spent time in Washington trying to get government officials interested in what he believed was a serious public safety crisis. His argument was straightforward. American automakers were designing cars primarily for visual appeal and profit, while consistently neglecting safety features that would protect drivers and passengers in crashes. Seat belts, padding on dashboards, steering columns that didn't impale drivers on impact. These were afterthoughts, luxuries, things the industry addressed only when regulations forced them to. And one car, in his view, represented everything wrong with this approach. In 1965, Nader published a book called Unsafe at Any Speed. The full title was actually Unsafe at Any Speed, The Design and Dangers of the American Automobile, and it was a sweeping critique of the entire industry. It covered steering failures, inadequate brakes, interior hazards, and a dozen other issues across multiple manufacturers. But the chapter that everyone read, the chapter that made the book a bestseller, that put it on the front page of newspapers, that got Nader invited to testify before the United States Senate, was Chapter 1. He called it the sporty Corvair, the one-car accident. Nader's indictment was surgical and devastating. He argued that General Motors had been aware of the Corvair's handling deficiencies from the beginning. He cited the rejected anti-roll bar, the $15 fix. He cited engineering documents. He cited accident reports. He cited the testimony of people who had been injured and families who had lost someone. His conclusion was not that the Corvair was merely an imperfect car. His conclusion was that General Motors had knowingly sold a dangerous vehicle, had rejected cheap and simple solutions to its problems, and had placed the calculation of profit above the safety of the American public. The book hit like a thunderclap. Almost overnight, the Corvair transformed in the public imagination from an interesting, slightly unusual compact car into a symbol of corporate irresponsibility. The Senate began holding hearings on automobile safety. Witnesses were called. Executives sweated under camera lights. The word unsafe became permanently attached to the Corvair's name in millions of American minds. General Motors was in crisis mode. And then they did something that, in retrospect, was one of the greatest corporate blunders of the 20th century. When the executives at General Motors learned that Ralph Nader was working on a book critical of their products, they made a decision. They hired private investigators to look into his personal life. They tapped his phones. They had him followed. They interviewed his friends, former colleagues, and acquaintances. They asked questions about his political beliefs, his personal relationships, his sexuality, his finances. They dug into his background, looking for anything, a scandal, a compromising relationship, a financial irregularity, anything at all that could be used to discredit him before his book reached the public. What they found was nothing, because there was nothing to find. Ralph Nader was exactly what he appeared to be, a principled, single-minded man who had dedicated his life to a cause he believed in and who lived simply enough that there was no skeleton in any closet. The investigation came up empty. But the investigation itself didn't stay a secret. The story broke in early 1966, and the reaction was immediate and explosive. General Motors, the most powerful manufacturing corporation in the history of the world, had been caught conducting a private surveillance campaign against a private citizen whose crime was writing critically about their products. James Roche, the president of General Motors, was summoned before a Senate subcommittee. In one of the most remarkable moments in American corporate history, he sat before the cameras and publicly apologized to Ralph Nader. The man who had been investigating Nader now had to apologize to him on national television. And with that apology, Nader became something more than a consumer advocate. He became a folk hero, the lone crusader who had taken on the most powerful company in America and forced it to its knees. The irony of all this, and I want you to really sit with this irony because it matters, is that by the time Unsafe at Any Speed was published, the Corvair had already been fundamentally redesigned. The 1965 Corvair, the same model year as Nader's book, featured an entirely new fully independent rear suspension that addressed exactly the handling problems Nader had written about. The swing axle was gone. The tendency toward snap oversteer was gone. Road and Track, testing the new car, called it one of the best handling automobiles in America. Car and Driver compared it favorably to the Porsche 911. The car that Nader said was unsafe had already become a genuinely excellent driver's car. But it was too late. The headline was already written, the public's mind was already made up, and no amount of engineering improvement was going to change that. Here's something the history books don't always emphasize clearly enough. Even if Ralph Nader had never written a single word about the Corvair, the car might still have died. Because while the safety controversy was unfolding publicly, there was a different kind of attack coming from an entirely unexpected direction. It came from Ford. On April 17, 1964, Ford Motor Company unveiled the Mustang at the New York World's Fair. And nothing in the American automotive world was ever quite the same again. The Mustang was, in many ways, the Corvair's mirror image. Where the Corvair was unconventional, the Mustang was reassuringly traditional. Where the Corvair was rear-engined and air-cooled, the Mustang had a front engine and a conventional water-cooled V8. Where the Corvair was sophisticated, the Mustang was accessible. But the Mustang was also attractive, affordable, and brilliantly marketed. Ford positioned it as a car for young people, for the active, for the spirited. The advertising showed Mustangs on mountain roads and at country clubs and at drive-in movies. It was aspirational without being intimidating. It was sporty without requiring the buyer to understand oversteer. America went absolutely berserk for it. Ford sold over 400,000 Mustangs in its first year of production. In its first 2 years, they sold more than 1 million. It was the most successful automotive launch in American history up to that point, and it created an entirely new category of car, the pony car, that every manufacturer in Detroit suddenly needed an answer for. Chevrolet's answer was the Camaro, which arrived in 1967. But here's where the internal politics of General Motors become part of the Corvair's tragedy. Because there was a moment, a real, genuine moment, when the decision could have gone the other way. When the Corvair could have evolved into Chevrolet's pony car. When its superior handling, its sporting character, and its distinctive personality could have been turned into assets rather than liabilities. The 1965 Corvair Corsa was a genuinely compelling performance car. It had the turbocharged engine, four-wheel independent suspension, and handling that made European sports cars envious. It could have been positioned as the thinking person's alternative to the Mustang, not faster in a straight line, maybe, but more sophisticated, more rewarding to drive, more interesting. But General Motors decided to play it safe. The Camaro would be the conventional pony car, with a traditional front-engine layout and all the V8 options the market was demanding. The Corvair would continue as a niche vehicle for buyers who wanted something different. The problem was that niche was shrinking fast. Between the Mustang stealing the sporty car buyers and Nader's book poisoning the well with everyone else, the Corvair was being squeezed from both sides simultaneously. Sales numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. In 1961, at the peak of Corvair enthusiasm, Chevrolet sold nearly 330,000 of them. By 1966, that number had fallen to 103,000. By 1968, it was 15,500. The following year, production stopped entirely. In 1972, 3 years after the last Corvair had rolled off the assembly line in Willow Run, Michigan, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration released a study. NHTSA had been tasked with examining the safety record of the 1960 through 1963 Corvair, the early cars with the swing-axle suspension, the ones that had been the subject of Nader's book and the Senate hearings. They compared the Corvair's accident rate and handling characteristics against comparable vehicles of the same era. Their conclusion was not what the public had been led to expect. The 1960 through 1963 Corvair, the government said, was not appreciably less safe than comparable vehicles of the era, including the Volkswagen Beetle, the Ford Falcon, and the Plymouth Valiant. Its handling quirks were real, the study acknowledged. But they were not unique, and they did not result in a statistically higher accident rate than the competition. Read that again slowly. The federal government, the same government that had held nationally televised hearings about the Corvair's safety, concluded that the car wasn't actually more dangerous than what everyone else was driving. The engineering critics had a point. The physics were what they were. The $15 anti-roll bar decision was genuinely questionable. But the sweeping conclusion of unsafe at any speed, that the Corvair was a uniquely deadly machine, a car that had no business being on public roads, was not supported by the data. It was a vindication, a complete, unambiguous vindication. And it came 3 years too late to save the car. There was nobody left to hear it. The Corvair was gone. Its factories had been retooled. Its engineers had moved on to other projects. Its dealers had filled their lots with Camaros and Novas. The vindication landed in the automotive world with barely a ripple, noticed mainly by enthusiasts who were already driving Corvairs because they'd never believed the hype in the first place. But even setting aside Ralph Nader, even setting aside the Mustang, even setting aside the corporate politics, there was a cold, hard economic reality that would have made the Corvair's long-term survival difficult regardless. The Corvair's engineering was genuinely innovative, and genuine innovation is expensive. The air-cooled flat-six engine required specialized manufacturing equipment and tooling that couldn't be shared with any other engine in the General Motors lineup. You couldn't take a Corvair engine and put it in a Chevelle. You couldn't take Corvair parts and use them to fix a Nova. Every component was unique to the car. In the automotive industry, uniqueness has a price. When you're selling hundreds of thousands of cars a year, unique components are manageable. When your sales fall to tens of thousands, those same unique components become a millstone around your neck. The tooling cost stays the same. The engineering support cost stays the same. The parts inventory cost stays the same. But it's all being spread across fewer and fewer cars. By the late 1960s, the Corvair wasn't just a sales problem. It was a financial drain. General Motors was spending money to keep it alive that could have been invested in cars people actually wanted to buy. The decision to end production wasn't emotional. It was arithmetic. And so on a Friday in May 1969, the final Chevrolet Corvair, a gold two-door coupe, rolled off the assembly line at the Willow Run plant in Michigan. The workers who built it had no particular ceremony planned. There was no official announcement, no press event, no moment of remembrance. The car just stopped being made, the way a lot of things stop, quietly, without fanfare, without the goodbye it deserved. Nearly 1.8 million Corvairs had been built over 10 model years. And with that last gold coupe, it was over. Now here is the question that haunts every serious student of automotive history. What if Corvair had survived? Not just survived, but thrived. What if the safety controversy had been handled differently? What if General Motors had added that $15 anti-roll bar from day one? What if Ed Cole had fought harder for the car when the Camaro decision was being made? What if the 1965 redesign had come a few years earlier, before Nader's book had done its damage? Here's what makes this hypothetical genuinely poignant, rather than just academic. In October 1973, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries declared an oil embargo against the United States. Overnight, the economics of American car ownership changed completely. Gas prices skyrocketed. Lines formed at filling stations stretching around the block. The American car-buying public, which had spent 2 decades demanding bigger and more powerful vehicles, suddenly and desperately wanted something small and efficient. The cars that thrived in this new environment were exactly the kind of cars the Corvair had been designed to compete with: small, light, fuel-efficient, well-engineered. The Honda Civic, the VW Golf, the Toyota Corolla. Cars that would go on to permanently reshape the American market in ways that Detroit's Big Three were slow to understand, and even slower to respond to. The Corvair, the late Corvair, the 1965 through 1969 Corvair with its sophisticated independent suspension and efficient flat six, would have been perfectly positioned for this moment. It was exactly the right car for exactly the wrong time. Had it survived 4 more years, it might have found a massive new audience among American buyers who were suddenly, urgently interested in the qualities the Corvair had been designed around all along. But the Corvair was already gone. And Detroit, without a sophisticated small car in its arsenal, was about to spend the next decade scrambling to catch up with the imports. Ed Cole, the engineering visionary who had championed the Corvair from the very beginning, went on to become president of General Motors in 1967. He continued pushing the boundaries of what the company would attempt, championing catalytic converters for emissions control, recognizing earlier than most in Detroit that stricter environmental regulations were coming and that the industry needed to get ahead of them. He also backed the Chevrolet Vega, another unconventional compact car that, in a bitter irony, developed its own serious reputation for quality problems and mechanical failures. The Corvair's successor as GM's unconventional small car experiment was, if anything, even more troubled. Cole retired from General Motors in 1974 and died in a private plane crash 3 years later. He was 67 years old. The engineer who had dared to imagine an American car built on completely different principles left the world before he could fully see how history would judge his most controversial creation. Ralph Nader went on to become one of the most consequential consumer advocates in American history. The settlement money from his lawsuit against General Motors, the company had to compensate him for the illegal surveillance campaign, funded a network of consumer advocacy organizations that Nader built over the following decades. He pushed for mandatory seatbelt laws, for airbag requirements, for the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. Whatever you think of his politics, the safety features now standard in every American car owe a significant debt to the movement Nader helped build. He ran for president 4 times, most famously in 2000 on the Green Party ticket. His presence in that race, drawing votes that might otherwise have gone to Al Gore in Florida, arguably changed the outcome of one of the closest presidential elections in American history. Nader has never expressed regret about his role in the 2000 election, and he has never apologized for his chapter on the Corvair, even after the NHTSA study offered what many automotive historians consider a clear vindication of the car. He maintains, to this day, that the early Corvairs were dangerous and that General Motors knew it. Whether history vindicates him on that specific point is a debate that car enthusiasts are still having 6 decades later. And then there are the cars themselves. Here is something remarkable. The very same Corvairs that were once considered liabilities, that dealerships couldn't give away, that owners were embarrassed to be seen driving, are now treasured pieces of American automotive history. The collector car market has been extraordinarily kind to the Corvair. A well-maintained 1965 or 1966 Corvair Corsa, particularly a convertible or a turbocharged coupe, commands prices that would have seemed surreal to the people who were trying to unload these cars in 1969. The cars that were once synonymous with danger and corporate irresponsibility are now celebrated for their clever engineering, their distinctive styling, and their genuine driving character. The Corvair Society of America, Corsa, has been active since 1969, the very year production ended. It is one of the oldest single-mark car clubs in the United States, and its members are among the most dedicated enthusiasts in the classic car world. They restore these cars with meticulous attention to detail. They maintain them. They drive them on weekends and at car shows and in rallies. They are keeping alive something that the corporate accountants and the public controversy and the march of time all conspired to kill. Walk around a beautiful late-model Corvair today. Really take your time with it, and you start to see what the people who loved these cars always saw. The clean, uncluttered lines that don't look dated the way so many cars from that era do. The clever layout that puts usable storage up front, and the mechanical complexity out back where it belongs. The way the car sits low and planted, suggesting capability even at a standstill. Sit in the driver's seat of a well-tuned 1966 Corvair Corsa with a turbocharged engine and the 4-speed manual transmission. Start it up and listen to that flat 6 come to life. Not the roar of a V8, but a distinctive, purposeful sound that's entirely its own. Drive it on a winding road. Feel the way the weight is balanced. Feel how precisely it responds to your inputs. You understand immediately what Ed Cole was trying to do. And you feel, somewhere in your chest, a small and genuine grief for what might have been. The story of the Chevrolet Corvair is told in automotive circles primarily as a story about safety, about whether the car was dangerous, about whether Nader was right, about whether General Motors behaved responsibly. Those are legitimate questions, and they don't have simple answers. But there's another story inside the story, and it's the one that keeps me thinking about the Corvair years after I first learned about it. It's a story about innovation and the American market's complicated relationship with it. General Motors, in building the Corvair, was trying something that required its customers to think differently about what a car was supposed to be. The engine is in the back. Yes, that's correct. The trunk is in the front. Yes, that's how it works. It handles differently than what you're used to, yes, and you should know that, and here's what it means for how you drive. None of that was impossible to communicate. None of it required dishonesty or concealment. What it required was a commitment to educating buyers, to being transparent about what made the car different and what those differences demanded from the driver. General Motors never made that commitment. They marketed the Corvair like any other car, downplayed its quirks, minimized its learning curve, and hoped the problems wouldn't surface. When they did surface, the company's instinct was to protect itself rather than to be straight with the public. The engineering failure, the rejected anti-roll bar, was real, but the communication failure was just as significant. American buyers in 1960 weren't wrong to be surprised when a Corvair behaved differently than they expected. They hadn't been told to expect anything different. Innovation only survives if people understand what they're getting. The Corvair was a brilliant engineering statement that nobody adequately explained. And so it died. Not with a bang, but with a whimper. Not in a moment of crisis, but in a slow, painful, years-long decline that the people who built it could see coming and couldn't stop. Sometimes on a quiet country road, the kind of road that winds through the hills of Ohio or Pennsylvania or the low mountains of Tennessee, you'll see one. A Corvair, perfectly maintained, moving through the landscape with a quiet authority that turns heads. And if you know the story, if you know what that car represents, what it was trying to be, what it almost became, and what killed it, you see it differently than just a pretty old car. You see an argument for a different kind of America, a different kind of automotive industry, a different way of thinking about what cars could be. You see the ghost of a road not taken. The Corvair was ahead of its time. It was mismanaged. It was falsely condemned. It was abandoned before history had a chance to vindicate it. And when history finally did vindicate it, nobody was paying attention. But somewhere in a climate-controlled garage, or on a sun-warmed driveway, or rolling through a Saturday morning car show, there's a Corvair that someone has kept alive through decades of parts hunting and careful maintenance and pure love for what this car represented. Ed Cole's dream didn't die. It just found a smaller audience than he intended. And for those of us who know the story, who understand what it cost and what it could have been, that's enough. It has to be. This has been the story of the Chevrolet Corvair, a car that dared to be genuinely different, a car America almost accepted, a car that deserved better than it got, and maybe, just maybe, a car whose time has never really ended, just waiting quietly for someone to give it a second look.